Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Simply Sketchy. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about D&D, and with that, I'm bringing the Duchess of Dragons with me. Hello, Yizz.
That's an interesting title. Thank you for calling me that. Welcome, indeed. I am very happy to be here. You and I have been friends for quite some time, and I have yet to be on one of these, but we made it work today. And when we talked about what to discuss, I like to get away from politics and culture war stuff. So I thought just talking about Dungeons and Dragons, what I like and don't like about it in general, and various editions of it would be a fun topic of conversation for you and your viewers.
Well, that sounds perfect to me because we all know that politics can just go suck a fat one.
well, let me ask you while we're getting started here. What experience do you have with Dungeons and Dragons or role playing games like it?
Dungeons and Dragons started. I haven't played many times, but I've played a few games of it, and that was just small toss away one time things with friends, and then essentially mostly through references, because I got to learn about I got into fantasy through the things usually that D&D inspired, and of
Huh?
course Tolkien.
Hmm.
So it's
So,
yeah.
have you played any games that are not D&D but are still role playing games with dice and stuff? Have you played other ones like any of the World of Darkness ones or?
Yeah, I played a homebrew campaign with Christopher Everard, based on Hunter the Awakening, I think it's called.
Hunter the Reckoning.
The Reckoning, yeah. He did
Hmm.
a bit of a homebrew. He even made a own unique character, which was actually pretty solid.
Nice. I have a breadth of experience with the World of Darkness games as well, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Well, Dungeons and Dragons is something I've been interested in since I was young. My uncle was big into it and got me into it when I was a kid. And he even had the Dungeon board game. He had all the old original from the late 70s products. He had all the original box sets, the three different colors of box sets. I think it was red, orange, like a light, bright red, or maybe dark orange, and like a sort of a forest green and a blue original D&D box set from the early 80s. Those are the ones that I started with, and I slowly expanded my library over time till now it takes up an entire wall of my small house. I have products from current era all the way back to the late 70s on my shelf. I'd say I have 40 or 50,000 USD worth of role playing books and materials and box sets. Through the 80s and 90s, I put a lot of my childhood excess income into collecting D&D stuff. Skills and Powers, box sets, Planescape, Dark Sun, Ravenloft, all the wonderful splats and boxes that came out. So I have, I think the last time I counted, it was over 30 D&D second ed boxed sets, and I've just been collecting this stuff for years. I like reading it. Um, when it comes to playing, we'll get to that in a little while, but I wanted to preface the things I'm going to say to let people know that I appreciate Dungeons and Dragons from the earliest inception to the most modern inception. Uh, and we are also going to be talking quite a bit about Paizo Pathfinder and Dream Scarred Press, because those, in my opinion, picked up at least creatively in the late aughts and early teens, where Wizards of the Coast was failing. And we'll talk about that later. But when it comes to my overall enjoyment of Dungeons and Dragons, addition aside, we're not talking about additions and mechanics yet, but the thing that I love about Dungeons and Dragons is it lets a player who's very creative like me, or I guess I should say storyteller. I enjoy building, so I tend to lean more towards being DM, but I also love playing, and I've played a lot too. Um, Dungeons and Dragons as a hobby, it lets you take all of your wonderful imaginative ideas that you've been inspired from works of fiction, whether they be movies or cartoons or manga or anime or books of old like Tolkien and even older stuff, and it lets you apply all of that creative experience that you've had into a packeted experience for yourself and others to enjoy together. And I think that's really cool. I like the idea of saying, okay, well, what's really cool about Saruman and the fighting Uruk-hai? Okay, well, that's I can do something with that. I'll make an adventure for these low level characters that, we'll scale everything down from Lord of the Rings. So it won't be so big and so epic, but that's a pretty fun trope of there's a bad guy wizard who used to be good, and players have to stumble into figuring that out. Then what are they going to do about it? And then, oh no, he's got his own little army that he created with alchemy and magic that nobody knew about. So now that the heroes have to handle that. Like, that's just a really simple example of how you can take something in fiction that inspires you and then create your own through your own creative lens. You bring that to life in a new and different way, and then you get to play through that with friends of yours.
Yeah.
And I've always found that to be wonderful, because I love creating, I love role playing, I love imagination, I like action and combat and heroic deeds and really dark, sinister stuff, whether it be Lovecraftian or like dark, primitive demon magic, like bad guy witches and demon speakers from Conan and shit like that. So there's all kinds of wonderful fantasy fiction out there, like the James Silk novels based on Frank Frazetta's Death Dealer, called I forget the name of the novels. Like it's got the Death Dealer something, the Death Dealer. I don't know if it's just as easy as trilogy. Let me look that up. But I read those when I was a youngster. James Silk Death Dealer novels. Let's see what those are called. I read those when I was a teenager. And it's just called the Death Dealer series. Okay, cool. But it was a series of 3 books, maybe 4. I don't remember, because I was like 12 when I read them. But they really inspired me to get more invested in primitive, savage, dark fantasy, like Conan-inspired stuff. And so that led me to getting really into Dark Sun around 1992, 1993. Dark Sun was my first big delve into a purely Dungeons and Dragons setting. And then I moved to Planescapes around 94 or 95. And when I say moved to, I mean started collecting and really delving into the settings. So not to, because I could sit here and talk about just Dark Sun for the next 3 hours, but we'll skip that. Dark Sun and Planescape are both early 90s or perhaps late 80s originally, but they were big in the very early 90s as unique, purely Dungeons and Dragons created campaign settings. Dark Sun was an isolated, not connected via the material plane or other planes to anything else in Dungeons and Dragons. It was purely isolated because a bunch of super duper evil, powerful sorcerer kings, which were ridiculously selfish, powerful, evil men and a few women that wanted to become gods by using all of the tricks in the book, all the magic, all the lore, and siphoning off all the magic and energy that they could from life, the planet, and the sun itself. Because they were following in the footsteps of a big evil that did that even better, that made the world all fucked up to begin with. That's why it's called Dark Sun. Is the original OG super evil asshole in that setting is called Rajat. And Rajat, he didn't even have to go through a 10-step draconic transformation thing. He did it all at once. And he basically created this big super lens and tried to siphon the entire magic of the cosmos through the sun of the world into him. And it made the world just this horrifically violent, vile, dangerous desert shithole with a big, hateful, dark red sun, where it used to be a healthy yellow sun. So that's why the setting's called Dark Sun. It's very much inspired by like Mad Max and Conan stuff and post-apocalyptic fiction of the like 60s to 80s. And it's an interesting setting that I fell in love with. Then you've got
Mad Max and Conan. What's not to love, eh?
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, and it's its own thing. If you read it, your mind wouldn't think Conan and Mad Max, but you can tell that kind of post-apoc danger, hardcore stuff is definitely what inspired the men who created Dark Sun. So Dark Sun to this day is still my favorite Dungeons and Dragons property, except for a couple of adventure books which I didn't really care for. I think I own every original Dark Sun product, which is like 58 or 60 of them. They made a lot of little splat books, they made flip book adventures, they made a few box sets. It got a later in the 90s, or maybe even the early aughts, it got a lot of revamp. And no, not early aughts, that would have been 3.0 by now, by then, because Wizards would have owned it. So later in Dark Sun's lifespan, like after Skills and Powers came out in 95 or 96, more Dark Sun products came out, and they made a revised edition where they changed some of the special rules around psionics a bit. They changed some of the setting fluff and some of the relationships of the Sorcerer Kings and their city states together. I don't hate it, but like with most gaming products, I think the original is more interesting and more raw. But the later revised edition of Dark Sun, which came out in maybe, I don't know, 98 or 99, that's almost exactly a decade after it came out. It's okay, and I have all of the products and I have read them all, but I still think that I prefer the original. So okay, I'll stop bloviating about Dark Sun. The next thing that really pulled me into Dungeons and Dragons was Planescape by old Monty Cook. Now, if people are big into D&D and fantasy and fantasy fiction in general, they will probably know the name Monty Cook. Monty Cook has been a creative developer for Dungeons and Dragons since I was a child. He has written and co-written probably by this point over 100 well-known gaming books and gaming products. He's worked with modern World of Darkness stuff. He's made his own twist on modern World of Darkness stuff. He's worked for decades with Dungeons and Dragons and all of the not official licensed D&D products, all the splat books and Fantasy Flight Entertainment, Mongoose Publishing, all this other stuff. I don't know what hand Monty Cook personally has had in those, but those are the kind of guys that he's worked with and the kinds of friends that he has. People that are like lifetime hardcore pen and paper developer guys. And so he was the responsible one for the main thrust of Planescape back in the early 90s with TSR D&D. And that spawned one of the greatest video games ever made, which is Planescape Torment. And for those of you that like classic computer RPGs, you will probably know Planescape Torment, and I think it is probably in the top 10 best video games of any kind ever made. I think it is a fantastic game that is difficult to outdo. Just if you like that kind of sort of hard, challenging, puzzling mix of point-and-click adventure game and RPG game, like many great CRPGs in the 90s were, then you should definitely check out Planescape Torment if you have not already. But regardless, Planescape is all about the planes, as you might imagine. Well, what is that if you don't know about old D&D? The planes are basically their interdimensional cosmology, where you have certain planes that connect to others and certain planes that don't. So the way that I explain it to people without breaking their brains is just imagine a bunch of concentric circles, like you're looking at a diagram of planet Earth where they show you the molten core, then they show you the bulk of all of the mantle and then the crust on the top, and it shows you the topography of the mountains and where the different volcanic ranges and stuff touch each other. Like, you just sort of imagine a spheroid like that, and in the middle you have the elemental planes and the energy planes, and then they feed outward to the material plane, which is where all of the stars and planets and moons and asteroid belts and where all the mortals live, where the dragons live, where most creatures live and interact. That's the material plane. And then the outer shell is the big one, the infinite beyond. That's where you've got all of the outer planes, which are all the heavens and hells, all of the weird limbo planes, all of the gods' planes, and then beyond that, you have something they call the far reaches, the far realm, the outer umbra, things like that. And that just means where reality starts to break down, where you're at the edge of the universe, of the known universe. And that's the D&D cosmology. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, because you have connective planes, you have transitive planes, and they go through and around all of the other planes, except for the ones they don't. So it's very complicated, and wrapping your head around how the cosmology works and what the cosmology is in classic D&D is something that is not easy for me to just explain in a simple podcast. It kind of would require visual aids and me taking 30 or 40 minutes to explain some basics. So we're not going to do that. But Planescape is you play a character that is from not to the material plane. You're from one of these outer realms or border towns or something like that. And the adventures are about traveling to the different, known parts of the universe, or even unknown parts if you want to go on that kind of adventure, where you meet interesting creatures and weirdos and angels and devils and demons and all these weird things that populate the immortal worlds. And it's pretty fun. It is pretty fun. That's a good dragon horn, by the way. That looks like a third edition dragon horn. When I forget the artist's name, but there's one artist responsible for revamping the visuals of D&D Dragons, who worked with Wizards of the Coast. I think he was also one of the original Magic the Gathering artists. And in the 99 and 2000, they hired him to create the D&D Dragon, and that's why dragons in Dungeons and Dragons look the way they do now, is because of his complete and total revamp and creating a unique visual identity for the major types of dragons in D&D. I wish I remembered his name. I used to know that years and years ago, but it slipped the old it slipped through the old brain matter. I don't remember it anymore.
Well, I do have an editor, and Bassick will probably find it.
Okay. Well, if you find his name, I'm sure it's easy. You could just pop it up on screen when I was talking about it. But the reason I bring that up is the horns that you just drew for your dragon there remind me of of that artist we're talking about re-envisioning of the black dragon, because it had curled horns like that. I'm pretty sure. Yep. It was either the black or the green. I think it was the black that had the recurved horns like that, but you can check me on that as well. But I'm pretty sure it was the black one.
I mean,
anyway,
the fact that these this dragon design became pretty much iconic for dragons in general. Just look at games like World of Warcraft, or when they did their dragons, the entire black dragon flight is just inspired. Well, it's just taken from D&D.
Yep. I mean, and to be fair, Wizards of the Coast, they pastiche and borrow heavily.
Oh yeah.
Not to the blatant extremes of Games Workshop, but they still borrow and pastiche from other existing visuals and tropes pretty heavily for all of their content that I've experienced. And Dungeons and Dragons isn't really any exception to that, because when Wizards of the Coast took Dungeons and Dragons, they didn't really make anything new except for laying down better codified rules for the planes and creating a much more modernized mechanic system. Everything else is still pretty much the way it was, as far as like your general dynamic of, you've got fighter types, you've got sneaky types, you've got wizard types, and you've got priestly healer types. They didn't really change much around that. Now the mechanics changes were immense, and in many ways good, and of course, depending on the way you look at it, could be bad. So for the rest of our conversation now, I think that it is important to, well, actually, no. There's one more setting that I need to talk about that came out because of Wizards of the Coast, and that setting is called Eberron. Eberron is a unique, interesting setting that I love and still play today some. Eberron was a world that Wizards of the Coast did some kind of contest where they said they opened it up to the public, I think, to say make your own unique Dungeons and Dragons world, and the winner will get its own campaign book or something. And I wish I could remember his name. I'm sorry, I don't. But the guy who made Eberron is the one who won, and Eberron was so well liked that it became one of the best-selling campaign settings of all time. And Eberron is extremely interesting. It's not like other fantasy settings in a good way, and I highly recommend you check out Eberron. The way that the world is shaped, its history, why it is the way it is, what is in its Underdark, the things that orbit the planet. Like, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but if you want an interesting modern take on of exploring the space of what all you could do with Dungeons and Dragons to make an interesting fantasy world, definitely check out Eberron. And it was so well liked, it was even the campaign setting for DDO, Dungeons and Dragons Online, which is still up and running today.
Is it?
Yep,
Oh,
you can still play it today.
neat.
It's been around for like, oh god, 15 years? 17 years? DDO has been around a long time. It's been around almost as long as World of Warcraft. It's old. And I played DDO for like a summer, and it was okay, but, it's just a video game, and I prefer not a video game if I'm going to play D&D.
Hey, that's fair.
But it was
Many
okay.
many people I know who are big on video games say that the only way to really play D&D is the pen and paper.
Well, I mean, that's, as usual with art, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. If you love the video game interface and want the action and the input more than the sitting and laughing with your friends and, drinking soda or beer or whatever it is you guys like and laughing together about what ridiculous hijinks you can get up to. Like, people enjoy role playing games in different ways. Some people really get into it. They like the ambient music, they like to burn incense, or they like to sit in the woods and like really get into that physical, almost LARPing feel. Before LARP was like a pejorative, like way back in the day, LARP. Like, some people get into that element of role playing. That never appealed to me. That's just that's I don't, I think that's a bit silly, but it's not for me, so I'm not going to cast aspersions, but that's not for me. And then you've got people who just really like the mechanics crunch. People who just really love the, I'm going to take this mechanics set and I want to play in a big, combat heavy, adventure heavy game where we get to just do nothing but roll dice and use skills and try to intelligently use our spells and abilities and magic items to overcome these challenges. You're like, these are your typical, they always carry graph paper. They're rules lawyers. They've memorized thousands of spells and feats and abilities, and they can conjure it at the drop of a hat. And they enjoy using all of that knowledge to interface with complex challenges in a dungeon or in an old castle or something. Like, that kind of D&D appeals to me a lot. I very much like rules heavy, mechanic crunch, dangerous site-based adventures. Like, that's my bread and butter. That's what I love doing. So that's very often the kind of game I run, the kind of scenario I write, because that's the kind of stuff that I enjoy. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy less mechanic stuff. Like, I enjoy sitting around with my friends and just laughing and role playing and, like, playing low level D&D where, we don't, our character builds are not very complicated. We don't really care, and we just want to have fun and do the thing we've been doing together for 25 or 30 years. So we'll just, sit around and have fun with it. Most of my friends aren't into drinking or getting high or anything, so we have a pretty sober gaming group. But I know some people like getting blitzed and doing it. But so I, where was I going with all that? I was leading up to my talk about the different. The reason I wanted to talk about the different ways to play D&D and the different ways that I enjoy Dungeons and Dragons is there's not a lot of comparison, really, in my opinion, between certain types of Dungeons and Dragons with other types, because they're made for different things at different times. I will talk about the good and the bad of each edition very briefly. Original old school D&D that, like, before it was even called a D&D, we're just going to leave alone. It was very basic and raw and not very good. And going all the way back to where it was just a war simulator called Chainmail, I don't think it's very good for anything modern. It's interesting to read about, especially academically, but I don't think that it's worth your time. Early advanced Dungeons and Dragons, like the stuff that came out in the very late 70s up to like 1985, that is your original D&D. That's where you have the original colored box sets before it was called AD&D, which is the very basic D&D, where the only classes you had were elf, dwarf, fighter, thief, and magic user. That was basically it. That's all you had. Advanced D&D added a lot more. It added more depth of mechanics. It added more classes. It actually had you being able to pick a race and a class instead of those two things being the same thing. And it opened up this concept of splat book, where you would have a core rule book and then alternate rule books. And I think the first big ones were Unearthed Arcana and Oriental Adventures. These added new classes, new weapons, new abilities that added like the ninja class, the Sohei class, the samurai stuff, the sword saint, which was I think called Kensai. It added the Hingyokai, the shape shifting race, the spirit folk, and you had Unearthed Arcana uh, telling you all. The Unearthed Arcana was a big book. I think it came out in '84. I think I don't remember. It's right around there. It was when I was a youngster. It came out and it introduced new kinds of applications of magic, rules about different kinds of weapons that were atypical, like pole arms and nets and shit. And it had alternate advancement. I think it even had a codified wild talent psionics bit in there. Um, Unearthed Arcana also had, I think that was the debut of, in a hardback book anyway, I think that was the debut of how to become a druid or a bard. One of the two. It might have been bard, where you had to do like 4 levels of fighter and then so many levels of rogue and so many levels of cleric or wizard or something like that. And then you became the jack of all trades bard character. I think that showed up originally in the 84, 85 Unearthed Arcana. But regardless, that is your classic D&D. When I talk about classic era D&D, basically it's the early 80s to the mid 80s. By the time 1988 rolled around, they were already into second edition mindset, and I think second edition officially launched in either 87 or 88, and that was really the big deal. Second ed D&D, you could find the iconic player's handbook with the myrmidon on the horse on the front cover. That was in bookstores coast to coast. It was huge, millions of copies sold. Then you had the iconic Dungeon Master's Guide with the cool dark black cover with the dragon and the I think it was an elf, some caster lady on there with the dragon. That DMG, that Dungeon Master's and that player's handbook were ubiquitous in the 80s and 90s. They were everywhere, coast to coast. Every comic book store, every gaming store, every bookstore had those. That was really when Dungeons and Dragons took off. And I think that second ed is where the vast majority of all great ideas have come from for tabletop fantasy role playing from then until current. So for the last 30 some years, pretty much all of the good ideas came from second ed. And I'll talk about that if you want me to. Do you want me to shut up and let you talk some, or do you want me to just keep
It's,
jab?
I'm very. It's a little bit of a give and take on these conversations. Sometimes we diverge extremely, like we do with some guests, or there are times where, like these, where you could just have the floor for yourself. Because I think this is interesting as much as I draw
Okay,
and I just
cool.
listen. That's cool for me, dude. Go on.
Well, this has been my primary hobby and passion since I suppose I was a child. So it's the thing I'm most comfortable talking about when it comes to just, make believe and games and playing and stuff. So the reason why I say most good ideas came from second ed is because second ed had a tremendous amount of money in it and a tremendous amount of products. You think that D&D is bad with the products now. Back in the 90s, there were so many products. I have hundreds and I don't have anywhere close to all.
Oh,
Like there were splat books and magazines and box sets and boxes of cards and collectible tokens and miniatures and different settings that you could buy that had their own contained rules for building cities. There were I can't even tell you how many dungeon master screens and player access cards and utility box sets there were. TSR, which was the company that was the D&D company for most of its life until Wizards bought it. TSR, they were prolific product releasers. Just in hardback alone, I think I have like 90 or 100 TSR books. And soft cover, I've got double or triple that. And that's not counting the box sets. That's not counting the dice packs and the map packs and the city builders. Because there was even an entire box set called City Builder. It was about using and purchasing these little 3D snap together city pieces for building terrain for using miniatures for your D&D game.
So it's
And
a collector's paradise or hell, depending on the
yeah,
angle.
and then you get into Spelljammer that came out in the 90s. Spelljammer is really interesting, but I'm not even going to go in. It's basically spaceships with D&D, but it's trust me, it fits the setting. It's not what you think. It's magic spaceships that travel space, but space isn't space, and ships aren't ships. It's just it's complicated. But anyway,
I've seen like the illithid ships, the
the
mind flayer
Nautilids,
ships.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, the
Nautilus,
Nautilids, yeah.
something like that.
Because they're shaped like the Nautilus seashell. They're called the Nautilids,
uh
and or the Nautiloids perhaps, and that's the Illithid starships, but or I should say Spelljammers. They don't use the phrase starship, but Spelljammer had its own series of products. It had its own maps for like phlogiston space combat and all this other shit. And then they started with uh, collection books, like because of how popular Dungeon and Dragon magazine, there were tons of modules and good ideas and new ideas for player races, new ideas for character classes, new ideas for spells and magic and kits, which that's what they used to call archetypes, and feats used to be called proficiencies. And then skills and powers came out in 94, 95. In the mid 90s, skills and powers came out. I think it was 94. And that was an entire new way to kit monkey your character builds. It had tons of new options for how to represent the character statistics, tons of new options for combats, and it was the predecessor to how everything since then has had some version of attack bonus, defense bonus, feats, and combat feats. That's basically where all of that comes from, was from the mechanics crunch that exploded in the gaming world in 1994, 1995 from Skills and Powers. And when you look at all of the products that came out between like 1988 and 1998 for Dungeons and Dragons, it dwarfs the amount of products available today. Like from any single company. Like if you look at them all together, there's way more stuff for third ed to current than there is, AD&D or second ed D&D. But as a single company, they basically launched what we know as role playing games as a hobby today. Just everything that you can think of, whether it's undersea adventures, cave, underdark, hollow earth adventures, taking stuff like Conan and Mad Max and making a setting, taking stuff like Tolkien, making the Severian tree that the elves travel between worlds, taking Lovecraftian Cthulhu stuff. All of that was conceived and packaged in some way by TSR between 88 and 98. You can find it in Ravenloft. You can find it in Greyhawk. You can find it in Forgotten Realms. You can find it in Pick Your Poison, Spelljammer, Planescape, Dark Sun. Whatever you're thinking of, whatever kind of interesting setting that you know about, it comes from or was pastiched and released as a second ed D&D product. That's why I say that's kind of where all of the things that we have today began, was with some kind of second ed inspiration.
One edition to rule them all.
Sort of, yeah. But now let's talk about the mechanics differences between the different editions.
I'm all ears.
No. Actually, before we do that, let's talk about spiritually why the editions are different. The
Okay, yes,
original.
I'm sorry for interrupting. I gotta say, I am loving this because you are maybe one of the most passionate guests I have on a while. We haven't had a single side tangent, and that is the first in this channel's history, and that is awesome. Just keep
Okay,
going.
well, I mean, you told me to talk about something that I like and know a lot about. D&D is, I like and know more about it than anything else. So, because I've been playing it since I was a little kid. So I've been playing D&D for like 40, 41 years. I've been playing D&D a long time. I'm old, kids. I'm old. I'm one of them Gen Xers. All right. So, um, The original spirit of D&D comes from nerdy autistic dudes who like reenactment of tabletop reenactment of fantasy gaming, of like medieval sword and shield gaming. It comes from a place of, hey, isn't all this stuff really nerd cool? Back before there was nerd cool, they were OG nerds and losers, and they really loved, like, you know, all the iconic old, knights on horseback, evil wizard stuff, gonna steal the princess, gotta go save her. They like that stuff. And chainmail is what D&D comes from. Chainmail started, I think, in the early 70s with or mid 70s with Gygax and his friends, and it was just a way to mechanically represent medieval battles. And it was very simple and not really anything that you'd want today, because it's basically just like a very simplistic early DNA of like Warhammer Fantasy and all the other tabletop war games, right? Just a very simple version of that. And you can even see a little bit of it, a little bit of that DNA in BattleTech, the way that they handle infantry platoons and battle armor units, things like that. But BattleTech is another thing that I know an immense amount about that I could spurg about for 100 hours. So let's not get off on a BattleTech
We,
tangent.
we can we can do
Let's
that for a different episode one because
sure.
I really need to brush off on my mech drawing skills anyway.
Oh, okay. Then we'll stick to D&D today. Dungeons and Dragons, what it is started in the late 70s, and it was because they enjoyed playing so much that they ended up having named heroes and characters with chainmail, and they wanted to represent having individual unit growth and having heroes emerge from the chaos of battle, because through luck and through good dice rolling, this character would survive and it would be rewarded by getting more powerful and getting skills. And that's sort of where the impetus for Dungeons and Dragons came from. And of course, the guys liked Tolkien and all that good stuff too. Mm-hmm. So Dungeons and Dragons was their way of saying, hey, what if we codify some rules for how to play heroes of fantasy warfare? And then it became what we know today. It became heavily Tolkien. It became heavily sword and sorcery. It became the D&D that we know today. And the main difference between before the year 2000 and after the year 2000, because we're basically at the 25-year point in each direction. Go back to 1975, chainmail. Look at 2025, 50 years later, we've got all this cancerous 5th ed, Paizo, 2nd ed Pathfinder garbage that I will properly shit on in due time. So the first 25 years of D&D, before Wizards of the Coast bought it and revamped everything and made 3rd edition, that is, in my opinion, the golden age of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, and I mean that spiritually. I don't mean that mechanically, because I think that the mechanics in many ways, not always, in many ways became better between like 2000 and 2006. They got worse in some ways after that, and only better in a little bit of ways after that. But we'll get to that later. Mm-hmm. The reason why I say spiritually, the first 25 years, the before Wizards, before D20 years of D&D, it was the golden years, is because that's when you had all of the people older than me that were not raised on internet pastiches and clones of a clone and all of this shit being the ones at the helm creating everything. You had passionate nerd men who loved this shit and were inspired by novels and comic books and classic ancient movies by today's standards, movies from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, inspired by dime novels, inspired by old pulp fiction of the 20s. That's where your Conans come from, that's where your Lovecraft comes from, that kind of thing. You had these men creating because remember, as D&D was getting big, the internet and mass communications was just beginning in the 80s. And so these guys were at the forefront of modernized technology meeting nerd hobby. And it exploded in a way that it can't today, because only people who were already nerds and predisposed to like this shit were going out and looking for it and getting involved with it. So the golden age of this was the player base, the customer base, and the creators were all cut from the same cloth. And that's why you had such active and involved Dragon Magazine and Dungeon Magazine. Dungeon Magazine, for those of you who don't know, was the I think it was every 2 months or every 3 months. It wasn't 12 issues a year. It had both professional and non-professional player-made dungeons, little site-based adventures, as well as new ideas for mechanics to go with adventures in magazine form that you could buy for like $6 or $8 at your gaming store. And then Dragon Magazine, I don't remember if it was a full 12 issues a year. It might have been, because there was a lot of them that I saw. But Dragon Magazine was the nerd hobby D&D magazine, where they talked about the behind the scenes stuff. Okay, well, what do we have coming up on the horizon? What movies and books have inspired us to do this? Here's a new idea for if you want to play teeny tiny creatures. Like, do you want to play a squirrel? Do you want to play a tiny pixie? Here's some new player race ideas for playing really tiny things. Here's some new player race ideas if you want to play giants, really big things that are big as buildings. And this Dragon Magazine was just full of stuff like that. Talking about the hobby, talking about what it was like as a creator, talking about TSR as a company, having interviews with people that were in movies, people that were in TV shows, people that were behind the scenes, people that were book authors. Dragon Magazine truly was the D&D hobbyist magazine of the era. And I read bunches of them. It was so fun. I didn't have a subscription, but I would pick them up and read my friends and read my uncle's Dragon magazines. And there was a lot of interesting shit in there. And
By
this,
the
like our
fans for the fans, right?
sort of, yeah, because the people who were at the helm leading it at the time, they weren't suits. They weren't money men. They were men who created the hobby and were passionate about the hobby. And in my opinion, that's why you had just so many products, because everyone involved was passionate about the hobby and wanted to just keep creating. And it wasn't necessarily to make a dollar. Yeah, of course there was that too. Everybody loves making money. But the guys that were involved, it wasn't like how Wizards of the Coast, owned by Hasbro, bought the IP and was like, let's make this a business and turn $1 into two. And of course, there's always that mindset. I'm not saying that it wasn't. It's just there's a stark difference between the men who created the genre being at the helm of the most important company that releases the products and being involved in the creation of those products because they are the target market for those products. That's a lot different than the companies we have today farming out D&D stuff. It's a world of difference. So that's why I think that most of the best creative ideas, and that's why I brought up Dark Sun, Ravenloft, Eberron, Planescape, most of the really great ideas for how everything works in D&D, why everything works in D&D, and the many different types of archetypes, whether it's a magic pistol gunslinger, whether it's a fast-moving elven spell sword, which a Pathfinder would call a magus, like all of these ideas and tropes that are the core of everything D&D is today, it all has its roots. They're basically on the shoulders of giants, is what I'm saying. Is all of these ideas were in a Dragon magazine, in a splat book, in a product you might have never heard of, in a boxed set that came out between like 1988 and 1995.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of the mechanics ideas, really the impetus for all those ideas came between 94 and 99, especially after Skills and Powers came out, which created this concept of you should make the rules sculpted to the character you want to play, not the other way around, if you want to make a power character that is a hero out of the gate. So now we're going to talk about the spiritual difference between modern D&D and classic D&D. Classic D&D is the opposite of what I just said a moment ago. Is you make a character that has an archetype already determined for it. You're a fighter. You're a wizard, Harry. You have laid out for you a path that you know you will be on if you are lucky enough to survive. And most characters don't. That is the major difference between classic and modern. In classic Dungeons & Dragons, it was not meant to be like modern Dungeons & Dragons, where there are magic item shops and it's easy to upgrade things, and there are MMO-style stores you can go to pay a fee to learn new spells and that kind of thing. Classic Dungeons & Dragons did have some of that, But that was considered a Monty Hall campaign. Monty Hall is an old boomer ass reference that most people probably won't know today. Monty Hall is a game show reference where you get lots of riches and prizes for basically nothing. So that's why they would. It's a little disparaging to say something's a Monty Hall campaign to grognards like me, because it means that you're playing an easy kid glove game where everything's pretty easy. People get tons of treasure and loot. People have lots of magic that's easily accessible, etc., etc. And unless you played a Monty Hall game back in the day, the big part of the fun of the game in its entirety was seeing if your characters could actually survive a single fucking adventure.
Yeah.
Because back in second ed, so many things from low level and especially at high level was, okay, make a saving throw or your character is over. Make a saving throw versus petrification. Oh, sorry, you turned to stone. Make a saving throw versus poison. Oh, you didn't save versus this magic black adder's venom. Your character's dead. Okay, you didn't make your no one in your party had the correct proficiency for knowing this type of Underdark or for Underdark exploration at all, and you don't have a dwarf with you to make your dwarven stone awareness check. So the party doesn't even get to roll because a perception check or a spot check wasn't even a thing in classic D&D, as dumb as that is. And so if you didn't have the necessary thing in your party and you happened to be in like a cave or an Underdark adventure, well, I'm sorry, no one in your party noticed that you were in an unstable area. So when these Ankegs attack or when these goblins attack and your wizard casts fireball, well, sorry, rocks fall, whole party dies, everybody roll new characters, even though we've been playing these together for 6 months. They're all dead. Like, that kind of thing is not even considered in modern Dungeons and Dragons. It's a mix of good ideas and a departure from previous good ideas, and it's a removal of some bad ideas, because it appeals spiritually to a different kind of player. People my age and older that are into fantasy D&D, we like a lot of that hardcore, we don't know if we're going to survive roguelike type of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that young people don't also like it. I'm sure they do, or roguelike games would not be immensely popular. I'm sure young people like that too. But what I'm telling you is that is a major difference between old D&D and modern D&D.
Yeah.
Is the game was designed to kill you off on purpose to make having a high-level character its own reward, just because you got lucky enough and the dice fell in your favor enough for that fucking wizard or that thief to have lived this long. And I think that's pretty interesting. That's pretty cool, right?
Yep.
So that is the major difference in concept, in spirit, because when Wizards of the Coast and the brilliant men that they hired to make D20 D&D, the open source D20 D&D, these men had a different vision for Dungeons and Dragons. They said, let's make a rule set that is simplified and doesn't require you to have grognard knowledge to be able to build and play and do pretty much anything you can think of. So that was the origin of core classes, prestige classes, and archetypes. That's basically the condensation of the previous 20 years of splat material, Dragon Magazine, homebrew material, hundreds of different class kits and class archetypes from all the different complete books. And if you're an old school grognard like me, you know what I mean when I say the complete books. And taken from all of the campaign settings, these men in the late 90s, they condensed down and made the D20 system that was released, I think, in September or October of the year 2000. So between 99 and 2000, they finished working on this new vision of Dungeons and Dragons, which was a more mechanical, computer-like way of creating any character you wanted that could do basically anything of any archetype that you could imagine. It's like, oh, do you want to play a fast-moving, agile, spell using spell sword elf, the iconic blade singer. Okay, well, we have an archetype for that. Do you want to play the iconic badass hardcore dwarven warrior that is just a big brick of metal with a shield and a hammer and you can't possibly be beaten or knocked off your feet? Okay, we have an archetype for that. We have a prestige class for that. And they said, okay, what about all these different combat options? You've got 50 books of combat options. What can we do with that? Well, let's condense all of those into like 100 categories, and we'll call those feats. And every 3 levels, you get to pick one. And that lets you custom build your character instead of having to fish through and have knowledge of 100 different products released in a way that you might not have even heard of because this was before the internet. Like, you would have to have knowledge of all these obscure products and magazines and books, and there's no internet reference. You would have to have it written down or actually have the copy of the magazine or the book or the box that it goes with it to do the thing.
Mhm.
And so the concept was, let's take all of these ideas of the last 20 years, especially the last 10 years where most of it comes from, and we are going to condense this down and make it appealing to players of any kind, new or old, or younger, old, new, or veteran, so they can take these simple core rules in these 3 books and build anything they want. That was the concept there. Now, part of the mechanics power creep here is when you do that, you are letting players by default make characters that are way more strong and specialized and way more durable and survive and are better at surviving anyway. And then the core mechanics themselves became much, much more forgiving with instant player death and instant player crippling and a way to get back from. Because in previous Dungeons and Dragons, there wasn't a spell. There wasn't a standard spell, and there was not a standard way to get back your levels when an undead or a powerful necromancer level drained you. Those levels were just gone, and you had to get them back through adventuring and XP. They were just gone. And so the concept of the negative level that has existed in D&D the last 25 years didn't exist. It was level drain. Oh no, that ghost level drained you. You went from a level 15 fighter to a level 13 fighter, even though it's taken you the last 15 or 20 adventures just to get enough XP to go from level to 14 to 15. Oops, do it again. Like,
Oh.
that's just how that shit worked back in the day, and that's why undead were so fucking scary. It wasn't because they could fly through walls, and it wasn't because they were with anything except the right magic. It was because the players were shit scared that a single successful attack roll could suck and drain an entire year's worth of progress, a real player year at the table, playing every month with your friends. It could erase all of that progress with a simple touch.
Ooh.
So that's why undead and ghosts and necromancers and liches were so fucking scary back then, is because they would literally destroy the work and the labor you put into this character that was lucky enough to make it this far in the first place. Not to mention, undead and powerful necromancers and certain demons and devils, they would permanently cripple your limbs. They would permanently blind you with very little way to get it back. They could curse you. They could change your alignment so you would lose your class features and you would have to go on an entire atonement quest. All of that was obviated and simplified into simple removal with the atonement spell, or just being able to have restorative magic, such as the restoration spells. Lesser, regular, and greater restoration. The heal spell itself was entirely different in previous editions. The heal spell got rid of basically all status effects. They added a new spell called Break Enchantment, which instead of every spell and every curse and every Gaius having its own unique, this is how you end it mechanics, or this is the type of spells you have to cast in the right order to remove this curse type of thing. They just added Break Enchantment and Remove Curse, which gets rid of all of that. Oh, did you pick up a cursed item? Oh, well, just have your cleric friend cast Remove Curse on you, and you can drop the cursed item. No problem. You're not possessed. It's not with you the rest of your career. It's fine. It's fine. Oh, did an evil demon possess the paladin and make him strike his friend? Oh no, he lost his paladin powers. He has to atone for that. That's fine. You have the atonement spell. Just go to the cleric. Just go back and say, "Oh, I'm sorry. Hail Mary, Hail Mary." Okay, I'm fine. I'm a paladin again. Like, and also the ability to come back from actual death or disintegration is relatively easy compared to classic D&D when you look at D20 and beyond after the year 2000. You even have new types of resurrection magic called true resurrection magic and true miracle, which they can bring back a character to life even if you don't have his dust. Used to be if you got ashed from a disintegrate spell, that was it. Character over. No coming back. It was it. You were done. And that's what the disintegrate spell used to do to you. But now the disintegrate spell, it only does that to you if you fail a fortitude save. And you can take your ashes. The ashes are enough for a resurrection spell. Oh, you don't have those? Well, true res or a true miracle, that can even bring your character back. It'll trim the party 25,000 gold, but you can still come back. You can even come back from being disintegrated. Like, the level of lethality went from present, at least somewhat, in the late 90s, as to ever-present danger in the 80s, to death isn't even a concern now.
Yeah.
It's like you have the same character, and unless the DM is specifically taking away things from the game and specifically forcing you into a low or no magic environment, the core mechanics in the regular book basically mean your character is immortal and can never die. All you have to do is have a priest and a druid in the party, and your entire party is basically immune to permanent death forever. And that, in my opinion, is the most radical departure from what Dungeons & Dragons was to what it is today. So, do you have anything to say about that? Because I know that I talked about that for a long time, but there's a lot more I can say about D&D and the differences between and how this core change matters, and talk about why it's good and bad.
From what I hear, it makes it a bit boring for veteran players or the people who are out for a challenge, because there is, I do like FromSoft games as a side
yeah.
bit, because I like the challenge of it, and adding that little oh shit moment, like with the ghosts and their level drains, or how being disintegrated is you can't get back from that. That is cool, and that is something that is a nice pressure to have. Though I do understand why they make that return easier too, but I believe that's for like softer players. No offense to that, or newer players.
I also think that a lot of the guys who worked on D&D 3rd Ed, they were veterans. They've been around for years, like Monty Cook was one of them. These guys understood real D&D. And a lot of them probably had the conversation, guys, you know what? You know how it sucks that you can never get a character above like level 8 without it dying 100 times? Maybe we should, make higher level stuff a little more accessible, and maybe make player death not as constant, because we create all these rules for getting stuff to high level play, but most people who play high level play, they just created high level characters to skip the unnecessary, in some cases, years of real life of gaming it would take to actually get multiple characters to high enough level to do high enough level stuff. So DMs in the 90s would just be like, well, if we're going to play this level 15 to 16 adventure, we're all just going to roll level 15 characters, because there's no way that your party already has that many characters organically leveled up to that level, because how the fuck do you have the time to do that with as brutal and unforgiving as the mechanics are? You just don't have that kind of time. So I do think that it comes from a good place. It's just, it dramatically changes, in my opinion, the feel and the world. Because let's think about it. Let's look at original D20 Wizards of the Coast 3rd edition D&D that came out in fall of the year 2000. You have spells like regeneration, restoration, remove disease, remove curse, resurrection, reincarnation, true resurrection, true miracle, wish magic, limited wish. These are all available in the setting to anyone who has that character class. I'm not even talking about creating magic items. We'll get to that in a minute. These spells existing on the list, and in D20 now, every character has access to their entire spell list by default. There's none of this, if you're a spellcaster, you have to go and learn magic from other people or find it in a book or a dungeon somewhere, or you just don't know spells. No, they got rid of that. So these spells exist, and in your fantasy world, thousands, if not millions, of intelligent creatures will be able to access this spell list just with enough time and personal research to have access to all these spells. So why is death and famine and plague, why is that even a thing? Like, there is no disease anymore. There is no crippling injuries anymore. So you have you have reasons to have real world levels of population problems. Like, if you have a let's say a dwarves, if you have a colony of dwarves who have priests that can heal the sick and raise the dead and make sure that everyone lives his entire 300 or 400 years of healthy dwarf life completely unimpeded by diseases and curses and maladies, then you start having an explosive population problem of, well, if this dwarf is healthy enough to sire children for 350 years, this one dwarf, then how do we have all of this big open fantasy world that isn't just an overpopulated mess of the people who have the best magic? How come humans and dwarves and elves don't all live in cities with populations of the hundreds of thousands and millions? And why don't we have a magic based super economy, since we never run out of things like healing the sick and creating metal and creating stone, and we're able to create and forge anything and everything all day long, every day, forever. We can make magic items to do literally anything, and it doesn't cost XP that matters. It doesn't cost anything other than, you know, a week's worth of adventure XP to make this awesome piece of magic item that radically changes industry standards. Like, when you look at what D20 is in Inception at third edition, it really makes me sit back and scratch my head and say, well, if this is how the world works, the world wouldn't be shaped the way it is. The world wouldn't be the way it is. If if every adventurer has a high success rate and a high survival rate, and all of the magicians have access to these wonderful spell lists of these mighty, amazing spells, and it's not very difficult to get higher level to reach fourth and fifth and sixth circle magic that can do truly wondrous things, then why isn't the world built around this? The entire world should be shaped around these spells and abilities and these mighty characters being the little gods that they are that control everything. So it totally turns the entire concept of the D&D setting on its head with the introduction of these new mechanics, but they don't turn the setting on its head. They kept the setting almost exactly like it was, but just sort of added in this conceit of, yeah, there's a magic item economy, and of scaling magic items of like level 1 to 5, scale 1 to 5. And in my opinion, those mechanics ideas are great until you start thinking about the wide sweeping cosmic changes they would have on how literally everything works.
Yeah.
The mechanics are good for having fun with your friends. The mechanics are great for having a simulated fantasy adventure experience, because your characters get to be badass, they get to do a lot more things than they used to could do, and you don't have to worry about losing a character that you've put several game sessions into at the drop of a hat for no reason, for nothing you can control.
Mhm.
Saving throws are much more forgiving, poisons are much more forgiving, crushing damage is much more forgiving. All of the spells and magic that I just bloviated about for 10 minutes, those are more forgiving. So all of that stuff does make for a much more enjoyable, more accessible, faster to get there, faster to pick up and play, more bodacious fantasy sword and board experience. But if all of that stuff is real in the setting, it makes the setting fall apart and not make any sense anymore.
Yeah.
So that is my major spiritual problem with everything that D&D has been and become in the last 25 years.
Yeah.
So anything you want to ask me about or anything you want to say in response to all that? I know I've been talking for a long time.
The honestly, it's kind of not many. Let's see. I need to think through this one because again, the much more forgiven parts again is to make it more accessible and for gameplay wise. But the thing is, what I like about D&D though is that it is up to the GM themselves to create like the
Mm-hmm.
set up the world itself because the books and such are guidelines from as far as I know. But if you have that kind of magic power creep, it'd be interesting to see how some DMs, if they decided to use those reasons, like
Mm-hmm.
how does the world not advance into this semi-godlike state, or
Well,
what holds it back?
I can talk a lot about that. Every D&D product, well, not fourth ed, I don't think, because fourth ed was. We'll get to that. Um, but all the editions of Dungeons and Dragons and most role playing games, at the beginning of the book, they always say the goal of the game is to have fun with your friends. You know, change or remove or add any rules that you want. Like, here is the rules that we present, but it's your campaign. It's your fun with your friends. You guys do whatever you want. Like, that's basically been the conceit of every role-playing book, not just D&D, but most of them.
Mhm.
Here's the rules that we like. Change what you want. Do what you want with this. Because the goal of the game is just to have a fun, creative time with your friends. So change whatever you want to change, right? Like, all D&D is like that, except fourth ed because it's retarded.
Mhm.
Um, so, um, in that pursuit, I understand that they presented a bunch of stuff with the beginning of modern D&D, third edition back in the year 2000. They presented a bunch of really good, in my opinion, mechanics ideas. They said, let's condense all this stuff and make it easier. Let's normalize XP progression. Because used to be, certain classes needed more or less XP than others to level, and classes had different level caps, and different races had different level caps for different classes. Like, maybe an elf couldn't be as good of a fighter, but it could be a much better wizard, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So, but they did away with all that. They just normalized all that, which is both good and bad. I understand mechanically it's good, but for world building, I don't like it as much because I like the different species having different pros and cons, not just in like numeric mechanics, but in potential.
Yeah.
And modern D&D gets rid of all that. And it doesn't come from a place of like what most people would think of, oh, it's woke or it's paused or whatever. No, it doesn't come from that place. It comes from we want to normalize rules to make this a lot simpler, and we want to let players play their elf or their gnome or their dwarf and not be gimped by arbitrary level and ability ceilings. Because if you want to play a level 18 to 20 campaign, well, what if your gnome your gnome doesn't want to be an illusionist? What if your gnome wants to be an alchemist, mechanical tinkerer? Well, if your gnome is stuck at level 12 forever, that really gimps him when it comes to being able to participate in high level play, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So unifying all that stuff comes from let's make the mechanics better and more agreeable with the concept of D&D, which is the storyteller uses these rules to make his campaign work. That is where the original D20 conceit comes from, not the everybody's the same, man, all races are the same, everybody can do anything equally. That shit doesn't come until much later in like the last 10 years. And
Yeah, that's
um
like 5e, right?
that's a 5th ed and Pathfinder 2.0. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pathfinder 1 is a little bit paused because there were women and shit libs involved with it, but there were enough intelligent, good people that understood the game and really loved classic D&D involved in original Pathfinder for it to still be good. And the D&D that we play at my house is heavily Pathfinder First Edition mixed with D&D 3.0, 3.5, removing some things we don't like about modern editions and adding in some things we like from second ed with some entirely new things and new conceits that we get from non D&D role playing as well as homebrewed stuff.
Mhm.
So uh, I'll tell you about that at the end, I suppose. But so let's talk about the evolution of third edition now. Dungeons and Dragons third edition created an entire new market. The internet was getting big in the early aughts. Internet business was already a thing. You had the ability to have PDFs. You had the ability to easily print stuff out. And uh, third party splat books were a thing for regular Dungeons and Dragons. They were huge. Palladium made a bunch of them. There were other lesser known brand names that made a bunch of D&D compatible companion books back in the 90s. That stuff was already around as a concept, but it exploded with Wizards D20 because of the OGL. They made the core mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons open license, so anyone could use it for anything. And so you had a deluge of small companies explode making alternative products to use with Dungeons and Dragons. Mongoose, Fantasy Flight, Sword and Sorcery. I think that might have been the Gygax one. I don't remember, but there were tons of companies cranking out D20 material like it was going out of style, man. Like I have maybe 100 or 150 products from that era. Not a lot, but like, I've got a few dozen here. I've got a stack of books from this company. I've got some Green Ronin stuff. They were weird. I have a bunch of red cover Fantasy Flight shit. I should say had. I sold off a whole bunch of that stuff back in the teens because honestly, most of it wasn't very good. Most of it was, let's make a bunch of stuff for this game without really fully understanding what the game was or why the mechanics were the way they were. And once I started looking back at all those products that I purchased in the aughts, I was just like, most of this stuff is not useful and I'll never use it. And it doesn't have anything of role-playing value or setting building value. I might as well just sell off all this shit while it's still worth something. So
it was mostly just cash grabbing at that point, wasn't it?
Yeah, and so between like 2010 and 2014 through eBay and local gaming stores, I sold off like 300 products of mine because I just would never use them or need them again. The things I liked, like the modules, the adventures, kept those. Some of the interesting Mongoose stuff, some of the interesting Fantasy Flight and Sword and Sorcery stuff I kept. Like the Sword and Sorcery's take on Ravenloft was pretty good, so I kept a few of those books. But most of the Splat stuff from that era, the third-party Splat stuff, I sold off the bulk of it because it just wasn't very good, honestly. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't doing anything new. The new stuff it did was usually obtuse or weird or just completely replaced and outclassed by Pathfinder. So in the very early teens, like I said, between 2010 and 2014, I got rid of most of that stuff. But let's move on now to D&D 3.5. D&D 3.5 was the Wizards of the Coast Dungeons & Dragons saying, okay, this went really well. Let's make it better. We released this ridiculous book called Epic Level Handbook very early in the progression cycle, which was a mistake. Epic Level Handbook, I won't touch on much. In the very early aughts, I think it came out in maybe 2001, very soon after D20 D&D launched. They released this big hardback book called the Epic Level Handbook, and boy howdy is it the most ridiculous shit I have ever read for Dungeons & Dragons. It basically said, well, what if level progression didn't stop at level 20? What if level progression was infinite or went to 100? What possibly could you do with that? They created epic level feats, epic level spellcasting, epic level monsters, epic level progression. And it was just ridiculous. It was like every other level, 2 to your core ability scores. Every level that wasn't that level, you got to add to armor class and saving throws and attack bonus just to get never-ending scaling numbers every time you level. And then the epic level classes, the epic level prestige classes, let you do absolutely ludicrous things. And it was just this, it was a book of power creep on purpose for the spirit of power creep. And some of the monsters in it were ludicrous. They were like 60 or 100 hit dice. Some of the monsters in that were just like completely undefeatable super cosmic dragons with hellacious breath weapons and thousands of hit points and hundreds of hit dice. And it was a book that never should have been, because it basically said, what if you want to play characters that are more powerful than gods and fight monsters that are more powerful than gods? And
like the Tarrasque?
No, like I'm talking about way powerful than that.
Oh.
Like ridiculous. Like a top tier cosmic dragon could like easily square off and defeat 5 Tarrasques and eat them for lunch. Like just absolutely ludicrous. Like especially if you used Epic Level Handbook to roll like, oh, I don't know, what could a level 55 wizard do? What could a level 60 fighter do? Like it's absurd what you could do with the mechanics. Like we're talking like making a fighter that you could shoot with starship lasers and he might survive because he would just have enough hit points to not be vaporized. we're talking about having a wizard that has a high enough level and enough epic spell casting and a high enough spellcraft check to create his own epic spell from epic spell seeds, which was a thing in that book. To create a spell that would require a ritual and for him to give up a year of his life to create a meteor that was the size of Manhattan that would destroy a world. Like, there were epic spell seeds for literally creating stuff like that. So
So from
it was
bringing
a
yeah.
book of power creep, basically, and absolutely unnecessary. But go ahead.
So basically, you would be able to either cast down a actual meteor and restart and do the dinosaur. Let's put it like that. Or you
Or do a
could,
real genocide where
yeah.
every wood elf on this continent dies right now. Or
Uh,
I'm going to use the Genesis seed and create a new world, or create a new race, or create a new kind of dragon. Like,
hmm.
the epic level spell seeds were literally the building blocks of being a god, and it was ludicrous what you could do with that shit. So
That's a bit much. I was thinking
so
just in face tanking a gun from the Bismarck.
yeah, stuff like that, right? Like, but anyway, so epic levels were a mistake. They should have never done it the way that they did it. And epic level progression, if you want to have, you know, progression beyond max level, it should be the way that we handle it personally. We call it investitures.
Hmm?
Other games that have done similar things, you have oh, what did EverQuest call it? When you hit max level in EverQuest, and you got enough XP to level up again, you could spend that on alternate advancement points. That's what they called it. So you would get AAP in EverQuest. Like, I think that's a better way to handle player rewards if you want to play level 20 characters a long time.
Yep.
Is just give them non-standard rewards as they do interesting things. And that's what led to the concept of the Mythic Adventures book for Pathfinder many years later. In the teens, I think it was 2013, 2014, I don't remember exactly when it came out, for Pathfinder 1.0. It could have been earlier than that, but I think it was in 2013 or 2014. A book came out that was like the Epic Level Handbook, but better and different for Pathfinder 1.0, called Mythic Adventures. Mythic was an alternate thing you could add to any character, whether it was a level 1 character or a level 20 character. Mythic is a type of character that, for whatever reason, whether you touched an ancient artifact and got magical mission goo, or you were born Hercules, a demigod, or a divinity from beyond touched you and flagged you as its chosen champion, there were many different ways to say a character was a mythic character. And a mythic character was a normal character of like a normal fighter or wizard or whatever. But you had an alternate advancement track called your mythic track. And you would advance the more mythic shit you did. So you would fight and adventure and explore and research your spells and do all the normal D&D stuff to level up your characters. But if you were a mythic character, when you accomplished mythic feats, doing mythic deeds, your mythic track would advance a level. And mythic traits and mythic feats, these were like the realm of demigods and vestiges of the old Epic Level Handbook from 15 years before, right? So that was a much better, healthier way to add in all this epic shit than just infinite advancement, line go up, numbers go up, right? Like, that was just a much better way to handle that if you wanted to play, you know, cosmically blessed super characters with super ability. And the abilities weren't very super, by the way. It just let you do, like, the mythic stuff lets you do mythic things, like the 7 League Stride, where, you know, you can run real fast and then jump for miles and miles and miles, or jump into the clouds. And it's a bunch of interesting mechanic stuff that lets you, like for a wizard or for a Hierophant, it would let you catch touch spells at range. It would let you be able to ignore certain components. Like, I don't ever have to use material components for this spell anymore. Oh, isn't that great? Or I never have to use somatic components, so I can just keep my hands folded in my robe and just cast spells out of my eyes. Shit like that. So, you know, just a bunch of nifty, interesting, mechanically powerful things that are not just line go up for ever bigger numbers. It was just, it handled that type of power creep in a much better way that fits the concept of the game in a healthier way, in my opinion. So that was like the improvement of epic levels, uh, of like the early aughts to the mid teens. Now let's talk about what D&D 3.5 was, because I kind of moved away from that when I started talking about Epic Level Handbook. D&D 3.5 was basically the same rules as 3.0, with basically no exception. Anything from 3.5 and 3.0 is completely compatible, except for a couple of tiny little fiddly things that aren't worth mentioning. 3.5 was just the big, sort of like Doom 2 to Doom 1. It was the bigger, better, more involved, better mechanics, better written, better thought through version of D20 D&D.
Hmm.
And you had better prestige classes, you had better mechanics, better splat books, higher quality material coming out for the game. And D&D 3.5 basically started just a few years after the explosion in popularity of D&D 3.0. I think it was only like 3 years, 4 years before they started calling it D&D 3.5. It only took a few years of success for them to do 3.5. And so for like the next, I don't know, 6, 8 years, everything D&D was 3.5. And that is the bulk of what people think of when they think of D20 Dungeons and Dragons. They think of what came about during that era. Then 4th edition. Let me talk about 4th edition briefly. It isn't Dungeons and Dragons. They completely slaughtered and destroyed all of the lore for all of the major campaign worlds, especially Forgotten Realms. It didn't need to exist, and it only existed to try to capture the digital market of MMO players. D&D 4th edition is not Dungeons and Dragons in spirit. It's not Dungeons and Dragons mechanically. It's not Dungeons and Dragons in the setting. It is not Dungeons and Dragons. They used that IP to try to launch their own sort of MMO online fantasy game. But for whatever reason in development, the digital version of it got shelved. And so they just released the book form of what they were building for their digital interface and called it 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Isn't that the most retarded suit decision you've ever heard?
Yeah, it's want money, give money.
Yeah, it's like the suits at Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, they put, millions of dollars of development into this set of mechanics that would allow people to quickly and easily pick up and play magic and fantasy, sword and sorcery stuff in a square map, interactive video game setting. But for whatever reason, on the development side, the video game part of it, I shouldn't say game because it wasn't a game per se. It was like an interactive video game that you would build to use for your D&D game.
Mm-hmm.
And the mechanics were very bare bones. It wasn't in depth like 3.5. It was very simplified, sort of like how modern 5th ed is, but even more so and worse. And the mechanics were pretty cool, but they were like video game MMO mechanics. But I don't know the particulars because I couldn't find out, but in development, it died. The video interface died. I don't know if the suits got wet feet or cold feet. I don't know if it just would have cost too much money to implement the way that the developers wanted, so they just scrapped it. But what they did is they took the mechanics that they made for the simplistic video game style interface for running your D&D game and just paid a couple of guys to make it a tabletop role-playing setting, and they paid them to create a new setting to go with it to make Dungeons & Dragons a more unique IP. And they just destroyed everything. And 4th edition is a cancerous boil on the ass of the already dying zombie of modern Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
Like, 4th edition is just an abomination. It's an abortion that should not be. So never play 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Never read about it unless you like Schadenfreude. Don't care about it. Never look into it. It doesn't matter. It is absolute corporate garbage that should never have existed, and it's not worth your time. That's all that I'm going to say about 4th edition. Let's move on.
You heard it here, folks.
Now, let's talk about 5th edition and Pathfinder 2.0. We'll talk about Pathfinder 1.0 because that's how I will end the conversation, because that's the bulk of where I think a lot of really good role-playing creativity and mechanics sort of converge together is in Pathfinder 1.0, but we'll talk about that at the very end. D&D 5th edition is a step in the right direction from where D&D was with the abortion of 4th ed. However, it's borderline not D&D anymore, because Dungeons and Dragons is now so far removed from the original concept and the feeling and the mechanics of what it was supposed to be. D&D 5th ed is more in tune with what that is supposed to be. It represents D&D tropes, it represents fantasy tropes, sword and sorcery. You have the iconic abilities, you have the iconic classes, they do the iconic things. But the mechanics have been very simplified, the magic system has been gutted, there's no more summoning monsters, player items and player stuff is limited to what you thread to or bind to, just like you're playing Earth Dawn. It is a very simplified version of D&D 3.0. And I think that is to its detriment, because who is it for anymore? Is it for, like, children and women? Is it for people that don't really like D&D? Is it for IQ 80 Dindus and Gibbs that have been imported
I think
into white countries?
I think I know which it's for. It's for the mythical, non-existent wider audience.
Yeah, that's why I think that D&D 5th ed isn't for anyone, because, like, there are people like my friend Ginger Monster. There are people like Uzulu who are not hardcore D&D nerds, but they are entirely intelligent enough to understand 2nd ed and 3rd ed. They don't need the dumbed down simplified 5th ed. And if you're wanting to get your children into the game, well, you get your children into the game by running a simple game for them and introducing them slowly to different mechanics. If you are low IQ, I don't care, because I'm an elitist. If you are a normie, low IQ bell curve guy, this game isn't for you. If you're an immigrant, if you're a non-white that is from a different culture, respect Tolkien and fantasy fiction and stuff, this hobby isn't for you. It's not of your biospirit. It's not of your race. Make something of your own. I don't care. Like, this is what I don't like about big corporations making a product for everyone, because they end up making the product for no one.
Yeah.
And I think 5th ed suffers from that exclusively. It's a product that they wanted to make accessible to everyone. There's that ugly, cancerous corporate language, accessibility and wider audience type shit. And it's like they end up taking something and they put it through a grueling corporate fun and identity extraction process until it's no longer the thing it was and doesn't appeal to the people who did love it, and only barely appeals as a passing curiosity to the wider audience. And so they've basically created a terrible product that is only a boring, dumbed down, retarded version of the different versions that previously existed, that isn't really for any nerd community or passion or anybody passionate about Dungeons and Dragons. They've basically made it the fucking bell curve popcorn munching, put asses of bell curve normies in seats movie version of Dungeons and Dragons.
It's just
That's what 5th ed is.
yeah, just look at this random meme from something that is not at all connected to it. Oh, look, we're gonna add this and this to something where it doesn't belong. Or my favorite, where how they have been trying to gut Transformers for the last few years.
Yeah, yeah. Now let's talk about the abortion of Pathfinder 2.0. The abortion of Pathfinder 2.0 suffers from the typical anti-white pause that we see creeping into everything corporate, where you have to have everything be, equality and accessibility, and someone can play a cripple in a wheelchair, someone can play a mixed race, mixed gender mongrel, and like they normalize all this shit and put it in your face with all of this cancerous modern art that, like, these stupid cartoony big eye big face, like, it's like all the artwork in Pathfinder 2.0 is aimed at, like, ditzy transgender pretender 15-year-old women. Like, it's disgusting. Like, and
Or
the
the
mechanics are worse.
40-year-olds poison frog hair colored.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those, like, the cancerous purple-haired cat lady feminists that, like, Pathfinder 2.0 seems to be completely ran by at Paizo those people, and they are trying to cater to those people.
Yeah.
It is an absolute paused mess of modernity.
I mean,
I,
it's
I, I
it's like
can't
that
say
for
enough bad about Pathfinder 2.0. It is absolute anti-white cancer. Avoid it like the plague.
yeah. It
Pathfinder
is
2.0 is total shit.
it is basically like that for everything though. It's
In a
just
lot of things, yes.
it is just so annoying.
Yeah. But Pathfinder 1.0, you can see a little bit of that because clearly there were at least some paused anti-white shitlib people in Paizo from the very beginning. You see that in a few places. But for the most part, Pathfinder 1.0, especially the earlier stuff when they were just releasing stuff in magazines and splat books and stuff, that stuff is really good. And then you get your early Pathfinder 1.0, your Pathfinder core book, your original Pathfinder bestiary, the couple of those, the original Pathfinder Advanced Player's Guide, the original Pathfinder Ultimate Magic and Ultimate Combat. Those are pretty much where it starts to taper off into not very good paused anti-white shitlib content after that until you get into the mid-teens and they do Pathfinder 2.0. But Pathfinder Core, the original Pathfinder, is very much sort of like how D&D 3.0 to 3.5 said, let's take this and make it even better. That's what original Pathfinder did, because they introduced this concept of archetype. Archetype is a prestige class that goes over a core class, but it's not a prestige class. An archetype is basically taking a bunch of feats from third ed and saying, okay, if you want to play an archer in third ed, there isn't a class for that. You have to play fighter or ranger and then spend all of your feats making you good at archery, meaning you can't spend them to do other tertiary things. So an archetype says, okay, we're going to take this class and we are changing and altering, or in some cases replacing, these class abilities at these levels along a particular theme, whether it's a role-playing theme, whether it's a combat theme, a magic theme. Like, we are going to make an archetype that lets this sorcerer be a unique kind of sorcerer that does this. This is a unique kind of fighter that specializes in just two-handed hammers. This is a particular kind of what's another good one? A rogue that specializes in gentlemanly charisma skills. It doesn't get sneak attack. It doesn't do trap finding. It is a completely social urban rogue that does urbane gentleman rogue stuff. This is your archetype. So you don't have to spend your feats or take a prestige class to do that. This is who you are out of the gate. This is your core class. And to me, that is the single best idea of D&D mechanics to have come from modern era D&D in the last 25 years, is the concept of core class plus archetype. Because what that means is the Pathfinder classes are not like the 3.5 classes. Most of the core classes get abilities at the same rate, in the same way, in the same style of 3 different progression formats. And all the classes basically work the same way. Whether you're getting hexes as a wizard, as a witch, whether you're getting arcane discoveries as a wizard, whether you're getting rage powers as a barbarian, etc., etc., etc. Classes get their abilities from 3 different structures over the course of their 20 levels. And archetypes swap those out in the same way to give them things. They will replace X with X. They will slow down the progression of X to advance the progression of Y. This is what an archetype does. It will remove this basic proficiency to give you this basic proficiency. It will remove this skill bonus to give you this skill bonus. It is a wonderful way to say, hey guys, look, here's our 12 or 15 core classes. Here's an example of 50 archetypes that exist because of in-game role-playing stuff for the Pathfinder world Galarian. Like, I'm a wizard of Hubbada Hubbada, so I get this stuff and this stuff. Or I'm a fire priestess of I don't know, Ioma Dei or whatever the Phoenix lady is. I don't remember because I don't know Galarian. But no, it's not Ioma Dei. It's who's the fire god lady? It'll come to me. It'll come to me. No, it didn't. Sorry, I haven't read about the Pathfinder setting in a very, very long time. I don't know a lot about it. But regardless, let's move on. The mechanical beauty of Pathfinder 1.0 lies in the easy to access, easy to understand character building model that lets you listening to this right now, even if you've never played D&D before, you can read and understand, assuming you're a white person with a decent IQ, you will read and understand and intuit the character classes and the archetype system of Pathfinder 1.0 pretty readily. And that gives you the ability to make your own archetype to augment any core class to basically and easily build the character that you want to progress level 1 to 20. You can say, well, I would really like my character at max level to have this capstone ability at level 20 instead of this level 20 ability. Okay, I'll build that into an archetype. I don't want this character to use heavy armor. I want to swap that for something. Well, these archetypes show me the things I can swap that for. Okay, I'll make a note of that. And you can basically build the mechanical character you want to play level 1 to 20 without having to do it via progression, without having to do it with buying spells that change your mind or visiting a psionicist to change a feat choice that you made in your past so you could take something else to access a prestige class. Like, you don't have to do any of that. You just build what you want to build from the get-go, and you level up and get the things that you want at the appropriate levels. That is a genius idea that I think that the men who made original D20 would have approved of, and might have even wished they would have implemented as the original 3.0. It's so good, it's that good. And the way that they change a little bit in the mechanics from 3.5, like with combat special maneuvers, combat defense bonuses instead of combat defense and combat maneuver bonus instead of just having to hit an arbitrary AC number or make opposed rolls like 3.5 did. That I could take or leave. Like, there are good things and bad things about that. But the core thing that I like is in Pathfinder 1.0 is they took the archetype idea and made monster templates the same way. So you can create a fiendish or a celestial or a fey touched or an undead or an ooze or a Lovecraft far realm thing, and you apply that template to anything. You can apply that template to a Hydra. You can apply that template to a Minotaur. You can apply that template to a Mind Flayer or a regular dwarf if you want to. They have all of these monster templates, like a Lich. A Lich is a template now. You talk about a mummy is a template now. Or a ghost is a template now. A revenant is a template now. Most of the undead and most of the cosmic and outsider and demonic things, they're all just templates that you can apply to anything. So you can have your big fiendish pig, or your heavenly fox, or your far realm displacer beast that has extra tentacles and weird eyes that confuse you if you look at it, shit like that. So you just make anything you want, sort of like the build your own plug and play archetype system for characters. They also introduced that for making monsters and enemies, which was another brilliant idea that I thought was just a culmination of the last 10 years, from the year 2000 to the year 2010. A beautiful culmination of mechanic puissance of people who were deep into the craft of D&D.
Yeah.
So that is the real strength of Pathfinder 1.0, are those things. The sublime and perfect archetype and template system that lets you understand and see variable power scaling and know the things that you want, what power level those would be in a template, so you don't create anything too underpowered or too overpowered. It gives you plenty of examples and lets you build whatever you want as a template or an archetype. And if you're not a retard, it will be at least in the ballpark of mechanically balanced on power creep and mechanically balanced on number of things that you get, if you're modeling it off of all of the things that they've laid out as examples.
It just maximizes creativity. That's all it does. Gives freedom to the one who makes the story.
Yeah. And now let's talk about, we're come to the end now. We'll talk about the type of D&D that me and my husband friends use. We use a mix of 3.5, Pathfinder 1.0, and stuff that you might not have heard about, and things from various splat books like Dream Scarred Press. Dream Scarred Press made, in my opinion, the best representation of D20 psionics. Psionics comes from mostly the Dark Sun setting back in early Dungeons & Dragons from the 90s, that setting I love, I spoke about earlier. And then there was a little bit of it in Planescape Torment, and there were a few psionics books that were specifically for psionics in the 90s. And, excuse me. And psionics was revamped, revitalized, and perfected for D20 play by Dreamscarred Press. Uh, their Psionics book came out originally as a small paperback book that was not very great. The greatness was in there, but the art was pretty lame. The editing was pretty bad, and you could tell that it was a very amateur product. But then it got some notoriety as being, oh hey, this is actually a really good way to handle psionic. Oh yeah, this is good, and it was a third party but made for Pathfinder book by Dreamscarred Press. And then they released their biggest book, Psionic Unleashed. And they've released several splat books to go along with that, several of which I have, that are very excellent if you like an alternate kind of magic in your fantasy. If you want your fantasy to be more psionics and meditation and unlocking the powers of the mind, and magic comes from within instead of without, the Psionics Unleashed, Dreamscarred Press's concept of psionics is wonderful. And their main book and many of their additional books, some of which I have, some of which I don't, they have their own setting of an entire fantasy society based around psionics instead of magic. And that's really interesting. So I really like that. It's weird, it's alien, it's different, it's cool. And it gives many different core classes, many different archetypes, hundreds of different powers, feats, and abilities that are all psionic based instead of magic based. And
I
for those of you
really love
listening that don't know
psionics.
really, yeah, me too, me too. For those of you listening that don't know what I mean by psionics, think of sorcery and wizardry powers in fantasy fiction: the ability to fly, the ability to change form, the ability to do the impossible, mind control, traveling the planes, interdimensional communication, astral walking. Take all of that, but instead of D&D fantasy magic, it's like science fiction mixed with mystic internal meditation fluff,
Yeah,
where all of the powers come from manipulating ectoplasm in the ether, conjuring your managing your id, and
yeah.
bringing
Two
forth the creations of your mind's eye, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
It's
two very good
psionic in nature.
examples. Two very good examples could be Psychers in Warhammer. It's like mental powers
Yeah,
connected
sure.
to the warp, and of course you have,
Yeah,
in a similar vein, the concept of ascension in Stargate. As you're,
I can see why you bring that up, but that's not really. Neither of those things are what psionics are in D&D, especially the Dreamscarred Press psionics. It's just a different kind of magic. The magic comes from inside you, from inside your own mind and spirit, and it lets you manipulate ectoplasm that is ambiently all around us all the time because of the astral plane. It doesn't really
Mhm.
have any, like, you don't draw your powers from the warp, this dangerous thing like in Warhammer. You don't, and it's not like the other thing you said, the Ascension in Stargate. It's not really because of that. It's more just an alternate way to have a magic fantasy world where the magic comes from inside you instead of being part of the inner planes, the material plane, and the outer planes. And magic is just you cracking the code or being gifted the ability to work cosmic power through a divinity with divine magic. Like, it's the power comes from in you. Everybody has the potential in them. That's why they call your energy your psionic potential points, your
Yeah,
PSPs.
it's fucking cool. I like
So
that concept because
yeah,
that gives everyone the potential to have powers, but it's how you use it essentially.
yeah, and even if you don't want to play a full psionic class, like let's say you don't want to be a psionic class, they have rules for being a wild talent, for just having the basic introduction feat for being a psionic character. You count as being a psionic character, which means you can take psionic feats, and you can take a few feats that give you very low level, like level 0 or level 1 psionic powers, but only a couple of them that you can use as an untrained wild talent. So if you want to play a barbarian or a druid that has just a little bit of psionics because you're from that setting, you can still play like a barbarian or a druid or a fighter or whatever.
Yeah,
You're just a little bit psionic, so you fit the setting.
yeah. And also, you can, in case you don't want to be like able to use telekinesis or levitate, you can just use your psionics to like enhance your body, harden your
Yeah.
skin, strengthen your
Yes.
muscles.
Yeah, a big part of psionics is self boosting, self buffing. making yourself fast, giving yourself more attacks, giving
Yeah.
yourself claws, letting yourself jump, turning yourself into, a four-armed, four-leg Taric mutant monster,
Yeah, it kind of
turning yourself into a far realm terror that has a fear aura, that has tentacle attacks, that kind of shit.
it's kind of like in many ways can be like the disciplines from Vampire the Masquerade.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, at least
And
like
even in old
celerity and
school Dungeons and
fortitude.
Dragons, they even called its power groupings disciplines. Like you would have the psychometabolic discipline. You would
Oh,
have the and then the powers used to be divided into sciences and devotions. I think is what they called them in second ed way back in the day.
huh.
I think it's sciences and devotions, where sciences were the big powers and devotions were the lesser powers. And as you advanced and unlocked your mind, you gained a few sciences, but a bunch of devotions. Where
Oh,
sciences would be like, being able to transform into things, being able to alter the flow of time and shit like that. And devotions were your lesser things, like self haste, being able to heal your own wounds, being able to focus your mind to molecularly decay the bonds on manacles to make them easier to break, that kind of thing. Those were devotions. Where sciences were like the big dangerous psionic powers, and you didn't get many of those. The way Dreamscarred Press handles it, they just make it like magic. Level 0 is like cantrips, and the powers go level 1 to 9 like wizard spells. And the higher level they are, the bigger bodacious they are, and you don't get many of those. That kind of thing. So it's just like wizard spell progression, but it's a different kind of magic. So mechanically, it's completely transparent to the mechanics of regular Pathfinder D&D. So it's the same level progression, the same hit points, the same type of skills, all that stuff. It's fluffed differently to be psionics instead of magic. So very excellent. We use that for our psionics and our campaigns. We use a mix of the fluff and the mechanics of D&D 3.5 and Pathfinder 1.0. And the other major thing that bears speaking of here is we have radically changed the spell list, and because of that, the psionic power list. We have dramatically reduced the number of spells and powers there are, and use a thing that 5th Ed actually uses intelligently: rituals. When you think about living in a magic world, like D&D has been in modern D&D the last 25 years, everyone and everything knows what magic is, and there's a magic economy. Like, taverns might have magic brooms that do sweeping. They might have it would be cheap to have a ring or a stick that does unseen servant once a day, that creates a little invisible dude of force that does all your cleaning and heavy lifting for you. Like, it might be very common for a brothel, a whorehouse, to have a wand of remove disease that everyone uses after they have sex, just to make sure you're not spreading disease around town. Like, in a setting like this, baseline magic permeates culture, so it alters the landscape of role playing. So
yeah.
we got to thinking about this back in 3.5. Like, we sat down and talked about all this between like 2005 and 2010, and we came up with the ritual system that D&D 5th Ed came out with a decade later, and we did it even better than they did. Because what we did is we said, okay, all these spells that wizards research, all these weird fiddly spells that divinities can grant, or these spells that you can get from accessing, certain divine domains or druid domains, nature stuff, all of this shit is way too many spells for one person to have on his spell list. We're talking hundreds of spells, right? Well, a wizard is not going to necessarily go out of his way to learn how to do these, because if he's an adventuring wizard, he wants to devote his time into learning how to summon monsters, how to create walls of force, how to shoot bolts of lightning, how to burn his enemies' minds, how to charm enemies, how to dismiss enemy demons, banish demons back to hell or the abyss or whatever. Like, that's what your casters want to spend their time learning and doing. Those are the spells they will practice. Those are the spells they will go out of their way to learn. That's the magic they will want to have prepared, or as for known casters, ones that just know their magic innately, they aren't going to waste their known slots on all of the useful shit that makes the world work, right? So that creates two things. It creates a role-playing mercantile slot for a business wizard or a business priest that makes his life about using the magic that keeps society going, using magic that keeps industry going, right? That creates a socket for that, like your healthcare industry, your material science industry. That gives place for that kind of magic. And
Yeah.
so, in that pursuit, we thought, well, what about if the world is magic and we know that, and science and wizardry and magic has gotten to a point with thousands of years of learning wizardry and understanding sorcery and understanding the cosmos. What if certain spells and effects were just rituals that anyone with spellcraft could do? Like setting an alarm on your home, moving earth to like use earth magic to move a big pile of earth out of the way so you could faster and easier dig foundations for buildings or make trenches, creating food and water, blessing food and water, creating a permanent teleport circle or a permanent gate if you were wealthy enough to want to make that for your kingdom. We basically cut the spell list by half. We condensed about a third of the spells that just existed unnecessarily to basically do the same thing in different ways. We condensed those into certain rituals, like rituals of travel, rituals of transmutation, rituals of augmentation. And so we condensed the spell list dramatically and made our own list of rituals, both low magic rituals, which anybody could do, and high magic rituals, like creating the aforementioned teleport circles and shit. So actual wizards and practitioners of high magic were the only ones with high rituals, but they were things that required time, investment of money and resources, and required more than one caster to pull off. Those were your high magic rituals. Your low magic rituals were the basic bread and butter everyday stuff that were used for industrial stuff, healthcare, and just basic everyday life stuff. So we condensed the spell list to about 1/3 of what it originally was, and to a number of rituals that equals about 1/3 of the existing massive spell list. We created like 100 rituals and then like 50 high magic rituals. And that's basically the core magic that we've been using since 2008 in our game. And then fast forward 10 years when D&D 5th Ed comes out, lo and behold, what did they do? They did the exact same thing that we discovered and created ourselves at our table more than 10 years ago. They condensed the spell list. They said players don't want to be bogged down with all these different spells that A, B, and D. So we created the basic spells as just class abilities for wizards and sorcerers that never run out of. That's your cantrip, so to speak. And then all this other magic, they just condensed into a series of rituals and massively simplified and condensed the spell list into just adventuring spells. And that's exactly what we did for our game like 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So that made me happy to see that I was so ahead of the curve, that we came up with that, a decade before 5th Ed even came out. We came up with that before there was even 4th Ed.
You beat them to it. You beat them in the game that they now have the rights to, but they don't own it. Let's be fair. So I've finished the dragons. Got time to add a few more touches, and honestly, I'm astounded by how much D&D stuff you know. I'm sorry that I didn't say much. It's just I kind of got wrapped up in listening. I like listening to
fun.
stories, so
Well, I have fun talking about things, and I like blow about shit I know a lot about. And I enjoyed watching your art. I wasn't looking at anything else. I was just staring at you the whole time, watching you do this dragon. It was really fun.
Thank you.
I enjoyed this, and it looks awesome. It's really cool.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun doing this, and even got. I'm surprised I managed to do it as quickly as I did too. So I did a little bit more. Tried to do a little bit more background. I'm trying to work more with caves and backgrounds in general now these days.
Well, I like your process of outline, gradient dark, removing the dark with white brush or with eraser, and bringing highlight to the foreground by erasing via layers. That's a really intelligent way to do this kind of thing. I like it.
Thank you very much. That's high praise. Not used to being called intelligent.
I said it was an intelligent way to do it. You can still be a dumb if you want
it. There we go. Right. Perfect.
But no, I had fun sitting here just bloviating with you. I hope you're listening to me bloviate as well.
Oh, they most likely will. It is, again, just nice having something to listen to while you work, and many people actually like to just sit and enjoy. Like, I'm pretty sure there's a fair few people that actually watch this like to have it on in the background. They look at the progress gradually, but they maybe listen to it as they work. I mean, that's how I
Well,
do
that's
podcasts
cool.
usually.
Well, for all of you who listened, if you are a D&D nerd, let me know how you agree and how you disagree with me in the comments. I will read every comment on this video. I love to talk about D&D. I especially am interested in those of you who are younger, like those of you who are Zoomers and Millennials who are much, much younger than I am, who maybe didn't discover Dungeons and Dragons until, third or fourth ed. Maybe you don't have any knowledge or experience with the older editions of D&D. I would love to hear what you think about Dungeons and Dragons. And if you agree with me or disagree with me on the concepts and conceits that I put forward about the classic D&D era, like 75 to 2000. I would love to hear what any and all of you have to say about Dungeons and Dragons stuff as it is, as it was, ideas that you think are absolutely terrible about D&D that should be changed, ideas that you think are great that you and your people that you play with created. Maybe you have obviated a problem in the rules with a genius mechanical application. Everybody listening, tell me those things in the comments. I will read and respond to every single one. I promise.
Thank you very much. And I guess with that, it's time to start closing. So
Okay.
you wanna give a little bit about what you do? I mean, you do your own content
Oh, well,
creation.
sure. I cover culture war, politics stuff. I kind of wish that I didn't. I wish I would have picked a different career path for making content, but I do what I do. I created a panel show about 3 years ago called, well, actually no, about 4 years ago now, called Discordant Dragons. It's just a culture war political discussion stream where I bring on 3 or 4 guests and I prepare 5 news items which my guests do not know about. I choose current relatable news items about politics, technology, culture war stuff, what's going on with international trade, warfare stuff. I pick. I don't do slop, so it's not just her. Let's own the libs. No, I hate slop. It's not slop content. I pick interesting news items that I can ask an interesting question about, a philosophical or leading question that makes my guests chew on an intellectual, interesting question about the subject matter of popular news items. And I deliver that in the form of questions from fantasy dragons. That's why it's called Discordant Dragons. I pretend that the Council of Worms is an interesting box set from the 90s, which was revamped and made into a bigger cosmic science fiction setting called Dragonstar in the early aughts. That's one of my favorite splat book role-playing settings, called Dragonstar. And I pretend that I am the ambassador for planet Earth to some curious D&D fantasy dragons who are part of the big great dragon empire that spans hundreds of star systems. And they are interested in planet Earth, and they ask us questions, leading questions, to try to better understand our view of morality and politics and identity and technology. And they ask us questions about it. And so for like 20 or 30 minutes for each of the topics, my party that I assume, my guests on the stream, they answer and talk about that question. And then at the end, we are rewarded by treasure from the Dragon's Treasure Trove, which is memes, anything I consider to be funny or white pilling or positive. I just share a bunch of fun, good stuff at the end. We laugh together, we watch funny videos, etc. So
I've been a guest on your cast several times, and the memes are always just peak. And I love the dragon designs you find, and also again, as you say, it's a subject, then you come with a question, and I've been surprised over how fun it is to just think about things and then just
mm-hmm.
try to explain it well. I feel like I've done. There's a few episodes I've actually been really proud of myself in what I've been able to say.
Well, good. I always like having you on board. I know that you self-deprecate a bit and say you're not smart, but you're plenty smart enough to hang out. Like, not all of my guests are like boring autistic brainiacs that do nothing but read about politics and culture war stuff. I have on people from all over the spectrum. I have on artists. I have on engineers, other podcasters. I have on people who are working with fraternities to try to make America better. I have on America First guys. I have on pro-white guys. I have on people. Pretty much, I have on anybody who's not like a retarded far leftist. I'll have on anybody.
Yeah.
Like they like to talk. So I do my best to mix up the panel and bring on people from different walks of life and different angles on things, just so we have some interesting discussion and people will come at stuff from different angles instead of just everybody agreeing all the time. So it's pretty fun. It's pretty fun.
Yeah. We'll be putting a link down in the description down below to both your Rumble and your YouTube channel, and they
I
can
also
find
have
you there.
Odyssey. We'll need to do all three because my Discordant Dragon stream, since we speak candidly about the news and politics, for whatever reason, YouTube started giving the Discordant Dragon streams a hard channel strike every time I left one up. So for the last year and a half, I just have to delete the stream immediately from YouTube. So the only way to watch those streams after they're live is on Rumble and Odyssey. So definitely follow me on Rumble and Odyssey. Backlog of Discordant Dragons, which is the best thing I do. But all of my other content stays up on YouTube, and all of my content is available on other platforms too. But if you follow me on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble, you'll definitely be sure to get all my content at any time. So, and of course, I have the usual smattering of social media and shit, but you can find that out in all the links in my stuff. So, thank you for having me on, Trym. I had a wonderful time, and we'll definitely do this again.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And for everyone who's been watching this until now, if you like what you see, if you would like to use my art for t-shirts, mugs, or if you want to just hire me, you'll find the links down in the description down below to my Ko-Fi merch store, or you could just @ me on Twitter, just DM me, and I'll be able to respond as quickly as I can. I would also like to give a thank you to Robert Renato, our resident musician, who lets us use all his music in the background as we yap and draw. And of course, a big thank you to my resident Australian tech wrangler, Besic, because he takes everything I make and he uses this weird technobabble magic and he makes a video pop out. I'm just happy that happens. And of
it's
course,
always good to have support.
Oh yeah, and believe me, if I was a D&D character, I would have the biggest tech debuff ever. I can make a toaster freeze things. Well,
you have a gift.
Yes, it's a wild talent.
Very good, very
Yeah.
good.
And to everyone who's watched,
and I encourage all of your listeners to try out some kind of fantasy role playing or science fiction role playing. If you have not tried role playing with people who know what they're doing, it is one of the best pastimes because if you have the mind for it, the IQ for it, and the spirit for it, there is probably not a better creative pastime than getting together with friends and having some role-playing creative fun times together. I definitely recommend giving it a go.
It's a very satisfying hobby, and just it's fun. Both to do with friends is actually surprisingly fun when you meet new people who's into it too.
Oh, indeed. Well, I guess that's it for me. I hope all the listeners had a great time. And like I said, I eagerly await seeing what all you fellow autists and nerds have to say in the comments. I'll definitely go check and respond to everything.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Bye-bye, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.